really quiet because I guess it's 4:31. So I think we should get started in the interest of time. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Alianza's teach-in on the events in Ayotzinapa. My name is Mary Mendoza, and I'm a visiting instructor in the history department and the faculty advisor for Alianza. This event is the result of the dedicated work of some of Middlebury's most engaged students, and we are so glad that you all could join us for this important discussion about what is happening just across our southern border. Alianza would like to thank Juntos, the Center for the Comparative Study of Race and Ethnicity, and especially within that, Roberto Mensagarena for all of their help, as well as the History Department in support for planning this event. And we would also like to thank our faculty speakers, who I will introduce shortly. But first, because I'm a historian, a few tiny words to tie this to some history. The Mexican Revolution, which officially began on November 20th, 1910, was the first major political and social revolution of the 20th century. It ended the 34-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, and it began a series of events that transformed Mexico through land reform, the implementation of presidential term limits, and the nationalization of natural resources. Today marks exactly 104 years since the onset of that revolution. And today, Mexico finds itself facing yet another revolution, and that is why we are here. So without further ado, I would like to quickly lay out the plan for this afternoon. First, so that everyone has a full understanding of exactly what has happened in Mexico, Alianza students Edgar Mejia and David Olentesquiera will take a few minutes to explain the current situation, sort of blow by blow, this is what happened. Following David and Edgar, Gloria Estela González, Associate Professor of Spanish, will provide some context by talking about an historic student movement in Mexico City in 1968. Following Professor González, Mark Williams, Professor of Political Science, will discuss how we can explain the rise of drug violence in Mexico, and then Leticia Arroyo Abad will talk about the links between violence and the economy in Mexico. And to sum it all up and round it out, Alianza member Jacqueline Flores will talk about why all of this should matter to Middlebury. Why are we having this discussion here in Vermont, so far away from Mexico? At that point, we will open it up for discussion, and around 5:30, we will stop the Q&A for a silent march to Proctor, where we will hold a vigil in solidarity with those who are doing very similar things in Mexico today. Thank you very much for coming, Edgar and David.
Well, again, my name is David Estela. I'm co-president of Alianza. Thanks for coming by. And as Professor Mendoza just mentioned, we're going to do a quick blow-by-blow, just a summary about both the events and what led up to the events.
Sure. I'm Edgar Mejia. I am also the co-president of Alianza. And once again, we would like to thank you all for coming out today.
So just to start it out, to give you a bit of a context, Mexico, in a way, has never had a professional or reliable police force. And with that, because of that, there's been a long domination of the PRI institutional, it's the institutional revolutionary party, because of its dependence on patron-client relations, its co-optation, and its electoral fraud, all helped in perpetuating a culture of corruption and lawlessness that now increasingly threatens the state and its capacity, autonomy, and legitimacy. So shortly after his inauguration, previous President Felipe Calderon called on the army to combat the cartels. And in 2009, he sent troops to replace corrupt local police forces in some cities along the US border. But this only actually strengthened the drug cartels, who initiated a campaign of assassination aimed at the police and anti-drug authorities. Mexican citizens suffer from both corruption of the military and police forces, in addition to the violence directly inflicted by the cartels. The Mexican military and police face thousands of allegations of human rights violations and abuses. Human Rights Watch reports that members of the security forces systematically use torture to obtain forced confessions and information about criminal groups. Human Rights Watch goes on to argue that President Calderon should have reformed Mexico's law enforcement system and judiciary before actually launching a war against the drug cartels. By increasing the law enforcement of the unaccountable Mexican military, Calderon has weakened the rule of law in Mexico. So since Felipe Calderon's administration launched its war against drug cartels, since 2006, 85,000 people have been killed. Almost 90% of those deaths have been execution-style killings. Since 2012, 8,000 people have been reported missing or disappeared. And just in 2012, 2,764 women were murdered in Mexico. In 2013, 10.7 million was the number of households from which at least one member was the victim of a crime, which means nearly 40% of Mexican households. And in 2013 as well, 1,698 reporting kidnappings.
On September 26, 2014, more than 100 students from the Normalista School, which means student-teacher school, in Ayotzinapa, plan to attend an annual march in Mexico City that commemorates the 1968 student massacre. In Iguala, scores of municipal police and a handful of masked men dressed in black opened fire on buses carrying these students. 6 were killed, 3 of which were these students and 3 were bystanders: a bus driver, a woman in a taxi, and a 15-year-old girl. 43 students were detained in police vans and were allegedly handed over to the Guerreros United cartel. The Mexican government claims that students were intending to boycott a political event being held by Iguala's mayor, Luis Abarca, and his wife, Maria de Los Angeles Pineda. But students claimed to be there only to raise funds for the school. When news broke out of the 43 missing students, thousands of people in the state of Guerrero began peaceful protests demanding the safe return of the students. "You took them alive. We want them back alive," is what protesters proclaimed. Since October 4th, investigations have found 12 previously undiscovered mass graves with over 38 bodies, 30 of which have been confirmed to not belong to any of the single missing students. Many politicians have been ordered to step down from their positions, now including this infamous mayor of Iguala, Luis Abarca, who were fugitives since the students went missing and were arrested in Mexico City on November 4th. Murillo Karam, who is Mexico's attorney general, stated that federal investigations have found that Luis Abarca did indeed order the abduction of these students. Police are alleged to have handed over these students to the Mexican cartel, the Guerreros Unidos cartel, who killed and incinerated their bodies. During the press conference, before the last question, Murillo Karam said to his aide, "Ya me cansé," or "I'm fed up," which was then used by protesters to demonstrate their tiredness with the Mexican government. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Gloria Estela González, and I will talk about Tlatelolco, which was the student movement in 1968. Let's see. Yes. Okay. Mexico has long suffered violence from armed groups, since the 1980s at least, especially drug cartel violence. Corrupt governments have profited by allowing the free flow of marijuana, cocaine, heroin to US buyers, many of them here in Vermont. This is not only about them doing things, it's about us. If you buy any drugs, don't fool yourself. You are part of that dynamic too. The current president is a champion of laissez-faire governmental stance. Until now, he had managed to trick a global international press by deploying an impressive PR machinery, focusing on economic reforms and suppressing information about the violence that continued to happen. didn't stop magically just because he stepped up. Mexicans were not fooled. And now, Ayotzinapa has revealed, in my view, two new developments. One is the new levels of intimate collusion between politicians and drug cartels, where it is hard to know which way the money flows and who serves whom. Another is the presence of students as victims of horrific attacks. This, of course, is only relatively new development. No Mexican who has lived in the second half of the 20th century can forget Tlatelolco. 2 de octubre no se olvida. Tlatelolco will not be forgotten. But what is Tlatelolco? It is a green space in downtown Mexico City, surrounded by apartment buildings and one of the oldest Catholic churches in the country, which was built with stones from demolished Aztec temples. You can see the stones there. There, in the matter of a half hour, the army opened fire over demonstrators, killing many, in 1968. In that year, Mexico was hosting the Olympic Games. Motivated to put its best face forward as a modern, sophisticated country, the government spared no effort. They're very good at putting a good show. They did a very good job. While the games and the many cultural events embellishing them were being prepared, at Mexico City high schools, the military was repressing student conflicts. Among the casualties was the venerable portal of Colegio de San Ildefonso, which is this one. This is a school, it's a high school in Mexico City, destroyed with a bazooka. Hundreds of students and professors were harassed, beaten, arrested, but this did not stop the student movement from growing. I'm confused because this is a different software here or something. That's why I keep looking up. Okay. On October 2nd, the rally gathered some 10,000 people. And 5,000 soldiers and police in plainclothes showed up too, wearing a white handkerchief on their sleeve, and stood on the 3rd floor of the apartment buildings. Let's see there, you can see the 3rd floor. At the signal of a flare in the sky, they opened machine gun fire at the masses. According to the British newspaper, The Guardian, the Mexican newspapers were not really to be trusted, more than 300 people died in about a half hour. In 1968, the public discourse before and during and after these months of demonstrations that culminated traumatically with this event, the public discourse represented students as terrorists when they were really defenseless. Now, Peña Nieto has been dispensing threats and innuendos too, not as overtly, but plenty worrisome. Some headlines, let's see. Some headlines on marches leading up to the massacre are eerily similar to those found today about Ayotzinapa. And this especially was shocking to me. Just says, irrumpen ganaderos en CEU, pretenden desalojar el auditorio Che Guevara. So it's just as if it had been taken from 1968. You know, you could find it word by word. The word auditorio Che Guevara, irrumpen ganaderos, CEU, everything, just the same. So it's a little scary for me. It is disheartening and worrisome to be governed by politicians who selectively protect those who fill their personal coffers. Student teachers, the children of peasants, had little or no buying power. Worthless? Muertos de hambre? Nobodies? Is that how they are seen by those who trade on favors and protection? What the government seems to forget is that those muertos de hambre are students. They may not have money or power, but they have ideas, their energy, and their voice. Thanks.
Hi everyone. I'm Mark Williams from the Political Science Department, and I was asked to participate in this, and I happily agreed. I thought that I would talk with you all about how Mexico got into the situation that it's in today. I actually don't know much more about the incident with the 43 students than most of you do. I read the newspapers, and that's as much as I know. I do know that this is going on. This is a protest in Tijuana. This is a protest in Mexico City. Mexico City, this is the National Palace. This is Mexico City again, just a few days ago. This is a protest at the International Airport in Acapulco. And this is the in Chilpancingo, capital there in Guerrero State. Here is City Hall being settle-planed. And you can see that Mexicans are upset. Why are they upset? The key question that I'll be addressing is, what explains this spike in drug-related violence in Mexico? Why has it spiked so dramatically, so horrifically? And I have a multi-part answer to this. I'm sure it is not a complete answer, but I think there's a group of factors that play a role. Part of it has to do with the effect of US drug policies in the past and how this affected the structure and the nature of the drug market in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the flow of drugs, the type of drugs that were flowing between Mexico and the United States. Another part has to do with changes in the nature of Mexico's political system, and finally, most importantly, changes between the relationship of the Mexican state and DTOs, or drug trafficking organizations. To just get some purchase on this, I want to talk about history and contemporary times in terms of three eras. Three epochs: the old order in terms of the relationship between the state and DTOs, the collapse of that old order, and what I might call today the new disorder in Mexico. So what was the old order? The old order was a period of hegemonic rule by a single party in Mexico. This has been mentioned before by student presenters. The Institutional Revolutionary Party held power for over 7 decades. And during the time that the PRI was in power, yes, there was smuggling in Mexico, smuggling drugs into the United States. This was mostly marijuana, some other drugs too, but primarily marijuana. Drug-related violence was not that intense. Certainly it wasn't episodic like we've seen in recent years. Now, why was this? Well, one reason is that competition for smuggling routes of marijuana wasn't very intense between the DTOs. Smuggling marijuana will turn you a profit, but nowhere near the profits that can be captured from smuggling cocaine. So there wasn't that intensity of aggressive competition between DTOs. Then you had this hegemonic party in power, and that party reached an accommodation with major trafficking organizations. And it was sort of a quid pro quo. The state would provide some political protection to various drug operators, and the state would tacitly allow them to operate. Every now and then there would be arrests, there would be some drug seizures. These were more sporadic, these were more circumstantial. Perhaps an individual got on the wrong side of a powerful politician, and so the law was applied as opposed to business as usual. But in exchange for this, the DTOs, they would pay off various politicians and various members of the political elite, but they also confined their activities to mostly nonviolent areas. If you weren't part of the dark world of drugs or drug trafficking, and you were an average Mexican, your chances of being kidnapped or killed by a DTO pretty slim, back under the old live and let live era. Well, this collapsed. Why does it collapse? It collapses over time, and a couple of factors. One had to do with a change in the drug of preference of Americans. So Americans began using cocaine a great deal in the 1980s and onward. Please come in. Began using cocaine a great deal. US drug policies responded in kind. I'm going to talk about each one of these points briefly afterwards. As a result of that, the drug market itself began to shift and began to change. Particularly drug routes changed, and the commodities that were being smuggled changed as well. During this time, in the early to mid mid-1990s on into the 2000s, Mexico experienced a very dramatic and refreshing, at the time, democratic transition. But this sort of created a power vacuum as well. And as a result of these factors, the relationship between the state and the DTOs changed also. So first, what about these drug policies? Well, as I said, Americans began consuming larger and larger quantities of cocaine. During the period where marijuana was being smuggled through Mexico into the United States, cocaine that was coming into the US market was coming mostly through Panama and the Caribbean, and then into the gateway. What is the gateway at that point was Florida, Miami. For those of you with old memories like mine, you remember the television show Miami Vice. It was all about the heyday, the sort of cowboy period of drugs and violence that erupted in Florida in the 1980s. And the Americans tried to shut down that gateway into the US market, and they were successful. They heightened interdiction efforts, they heightened seizure efforts. The Americans invaded Panama and deposed General Manuel Noriega, put pressure on the Bahamian government, which had also been complicit in the trade. And so the Floridian gateway closed. Well, what was the result of that? One of the most important impacts was that the DTOs based in Colombia began, and other Andean countries, began shifting their routes, their distribution routes. With the Floridian gateway closed, these routes shifted up to the Central American and Mexican corridor. The North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, comes online in 1994, and this cements Mexico as the new gateway into the United States market. It's not like Mexicans asked for this blessing. It was a result of other factors. Coincidentally, cocaine displaces marijuana as the chief commodity that's being smuggled from Mexico into the United States. And the profits made from cocaine tower over the profits that could be made from marijuana. So the DTOs now have a lot more money to bribe, to intimidate, to buy weapons, to corrupt. They can penetrate state organs a lot more deeply. And because these routes are now far more lucrative, the competition between the DTOs intensifies. Now you're really fighting over territory. I was reading a report a while back from our government General Accounting Office, which said that, I think it was fiscal year 2004-2005, Mexico's DTOs repatriated $17 billion in that fiscal year in cash money that was literally driven across the border. Billions more was probably laundered in that fiscal year. In 2012, the DEA's budget was $3.3 billion. So you put those two figures in comparison, you see there's an enormous asymmetry. There's tremendous purchasing power, purchasing of weapons, purchasing of corruption, purchasing of political favors, and so forth. That's why the competition is so great, because the profits, the capital to be accrued is so vast. The second thing that I think, that I mentioned before that changed was Mexico's political system. The transition from single-party rule to a multi-party democracy didn't just end 7 decades of pre-rule, it also ended the government's ability to sort of regulate the operations of the DTOs. It ended the sort of blanket political protection scheme that state officials had been able to run with the DTOs. And at the same time, the DTOs are getting richer. Now they have to scramble to sort of recruit or corrupt or co-opt a whole new set of political leaders, both at the very highest levels of government, if they can find them, and at lower levels, on down into municipal levels. So there's this mad scramble. The result of this is a very changed kind of relationship from the past, from the old order, to the kind of relationship between the state and the DTOs that exist now. It's characterized today by a couple of features: highly conflictive, open warfare, at least on some levels, between the state and the DTOs who are fighting for their lives, hence it's highly violent. It's expansive. The casualty rates have already been noted just since 2006. And by virtue of their capital, their profits, and by virtue of the changes in the political system. Even while the war rages on between the state and the DTOs have managed even deeper penetration of state organs, to the point where individual government officials, such as the mayor, might be able to enlist DTOs to curry favor, to do certain little favors for political need. So the third period, because of this changed relationship, the third period is what I call the new disorder that's characterized Mexican society. Widespread violence, unchecked violence, an inability to actually curtail the violence. Someone earlier had mentioned Calderon's deployment of troops to regions close to the US border really did nothing to quell the violence. Widespread fear, widespread insecurity, not just for people who are part of that dark world, but for ordinary people, for students in college. A deep, deep lack of trust between citizens and their government at various levels. A deep lack of trust between the organs of the state. You don't know whom to trust because you don't know who's in alliance with the DTOs. So that's a context where preposterous things might happen, as appeared to be the case in Iguala. Here's an anonymous Mexican journalist from Nuevo Laredo. And I'll close on this. Violence and fear render the state useless. The state cannot actually perform the functions that it's supposed to perform on paper because of fear, intimidation, corruption. So violence and fear render the state useless, and at the same time render the citizenry defenseless. This is why Mexicans are protesting. Thank you.